Welcome, everyone. So if you've been following with us in the history of the church or the history of Christianity, you'll know that last time we were together, we got to the 6th century, and after we spoke about the Council of Chalcedon and the split, etc. So today we're going to get into the 6th, 7th, maybe even 8th century if we're lucky. So just a quick wrap up. So after the council, the split between East and West started to become clearer in the churches. You will see that the Coptic church in Egypt starts to lose its protection from the outside world, from the other churches. Egypt at this point is still under the rule of the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, and it is not necessarily protected, even though Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, is Christian, but it didn't necessarily provide protection for the Christians in Egypt. If anything, there was hostility towards the Christians in Egypt. This is a time when there are lots of things going on as we're going into the 6th, 7th century. The Nubian power, which is to the south of Egypt, which is a combination of modern day Sudan, Ethiopia, very strongly Christian empires start to get very powerful to the south of Egypt. Keep that in mind because that will come back to actually make a big difference in terms of the protection of Christians in Egypt. Also, this is a time when in Constantinople, the famous cathedral in modern day Istanbul, Hagia Sophia, begins to be built and constructed. If any of you have been to Istanbul, you'll see the church. It's been converted into a mosque. It's probably one of the largest mosques in the Middle East. It's still sort of a museum, but we won't get into the politics. Okay, so that's one of the oldest cathedrals in Europe because Istanbul is part of Europe. Okay. 7th century. So this is where the fun, well, not fun, but real huge turning point in terms of the history of the Coptic church and the history of Christianity as a whole. Major turning point. So what's happening in the 7th century? Heracles is the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, which is where Egypt is. The Persians, modern day Iran, become also a powerful force that starts to spread east into Asia and west towards Europe and south towards North Africa. They start to get very powerful. Just to give you a little bit of background, the Persians didn't just appear out of nowhere suddenly in the 7th century. The Persians have been kind of coming in and out all the way back to the 1st century BC. It's a power that was constantly coming in, disappearing. The problem with the Persians is that the Persian mindset or direction was not that of establishing new communities and spreading art and music or anything like that. They were, actually I read one history book that called them parasites of the ancient world. They would invade a place, suck everything they wanted out of it, and move on. So when they invaded the country, they didn't try to establish any culture. They basically took what they needed back to their homeland and basically left whatever country it was in total destruction. So 619, the Byzantine Empire, the emperor is basically off enjoying his time. He's spending all the wealth of the empire on his own personal enjoyment, building palaces, etc., and wasn't paying attention to what's happening in Asia. So the Persians easily invade Egypt. Actually, this is after they invaded Syria, Judea, every place along the path. They enter Egypt, and when they enter Egypt, they spend about a year and a half there until the emperor of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, wakes up and decides, oh, this is a problem. And he then sends his forces into Egypt. It took 6 years for the Roman or the Byzantine Empire to push the Persians back out. During those 6 years, monasteries were destroyed, churches were burned down, women were raped. Now, here's the thing. The Persians were not Muslim. They were Christian. They were Nestorian Christians. You remember Nestorian in Council of Ephesus? I'm not going to go all the way back, but so this is a heresy, a heretical Christian belief. We're not going to get into it right now, but the Persians were Christians. And they entered Egypt and they tried to convert the Coptic Christians into Nestorian Christians. A lot of people think, oh, the Persians were Muslim. Not yet. So it was Christianity versus Christianity. You'll see a lot of that in the first few hundred centuries where different Christian groups were trying to convert other Christian groups. So you'll find the Roman Christians trying to convert Coptic Christians. You'll find the Persian Christians trying to convert Coptic Christians. So you'll see a lot of that struggle. The Persian Empire, because of the mercy of God, only lasted 6 years in Egypt. They moved on, but here's what happened. So what's going on in the world right now? So the Persians are over there playing their games with wars and scavenging, etc. Meanwhile, what people weren't seeing was a new empire coming to birth in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay? Muhammad was spreading a new faith. Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, Arabia was actually primarily Christian. Muhammad was hiring mercenaries. It was becoming a very powerful army that no one was aware of, including the Persians. So here's what happened. When the Byzantine emperor pushed the Persians out, he went back off enjoying his time. What he didn't realize is he left a void in Egypt. There was no protection. So the Arabs, or the Muslim, actually I'm not going to say the Arabs, it was the Muslim invasion, because it wasn't just Arabs. It was starting to grow. It was spreading into the peninsula. It was moving north and east into Asia. Also in Europe, I just want you to be aware of what's going on in Europe. Christianity is growing very quickly in Europe. It's moving north all the way to the modern day England was becoming Christian. They were moving north, the Germanic tribes that we talked about, a century ago, that were attacking the Roman Empire. They were becoming Christian, and they were carrying the Christianity further north into modern day Scandinavian countries. So Christianity is growing in Europe. There are still no real countries. It's all these city-states and fiefdoms in Europe. The Europeans are busy building, going through their own kind of revival, not paying attention to what's going on. So I'm just setting the stage here. So 7th century, before the Arabs invade Egypt, they've been basically running through all of southwestern Asia. So the modern day countries of like Syria, Jordan, they didn't quite exist in that way, but they were just marching right through. They actually, remember the capital of Egypt was Alexandria in the north. The Muslim armies did not invade from the north, which is why the Roman emperor and his armies in Alexandria had no idea what's going on. So they traveled across the Red Sea into southern or upper Egypt, and they moved north. So here's what happened. Egyptians, of course, at this point, pretty much all of Egypt is Christian. So I'm not going to keep saying the Coptic Christians. The Christians in Egypt, they actually looked to the Islamic invaders as sanctuary. They were actually going to save them from the brutality of the Persians and the Byzantine army. The Byzantine army, although it was Christian, was pillaging villages. They were collecting money and gold for their emperor. So the Christians welcomed them with open arms initially. Okay? They looked at them as their saviors coming in from the south. Upper Egypt was mostly very rural. They weren't the most that highly educated as much as Lower Egypt, and they accepted them in. So when they came in, they actually, there wasn't yet this thing of, because I know people think, oh, from like the day they came in, oh, you must convert to Islam. It didn't work that way. They actually offered protection to the people of Egypt, the Christians. And as they moved north, the Byzantine army wasn't even in Alexandria. They were off fighting their own wars, trying to regain back a lot of what they had lost. So as they moved north, there was no resistance whatsoever. It didn't just happen in a day. As you can see, Egypt is totally captured in 642. So it took a number of years for them to move all the way north. So what happened is, I actually found some very interesting writings. So the Arabs, here's the difference between them and the Persians. They actually wanted to share their culture, ingrain it into whatever territory they invaded. Unlike the Persians, which is why the Persians were resisted and the Arab Muslims were welcomed, because they actually enjoyed exploring the new cultures. They wanted to share what they brought back with them, so they were welcomed. When Egypt is invaded, the head, by the way, this is a topic that we could talk about for hours and hours, so I'm just giving you a flavor. The person that was leading that army was a man by the name of Amr ibn al-As. Okay? I'm sure all of you who grew up in Egypt learned about this in school, and you may have learned some things that were true, some that weren't, but it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna talk about the facts. Okay? So Amr ibn al-As comes in. He originally, again, was very peaceful in terms of, obviously, they're an invading army, so they're not that peaceful, but peaceful in terms of, we're not going to touch you, we're not going to harm you, we're just coming in I don't know what people were thinking. They were coming in, for a picnic, but they were coming in, and they were slowly moving north. Amr ibn al-As, at this point, I'm just going to hold this in my hands. He comes in and he establishes in Egypt a base. It becomes the center of Islamic empire. Egypt was strategically located because it was in North Africa. It bordered southwestern Asia. It was across from Europe. It had the passage to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and it had the Nile River that traveled all the way south. So he establishes his main base in Egypt, and Egypt becomes the center, and this is why Egyptian Islam becomes the center of the culture, of learning, of like Al-Azhar University and all these things in Egypt, because Egypt was the place where the armies could now invade the rest of North Africa and Europe. So once they're established in Egypt, the Byzantine emperor realizes, we're going to lose Alexandria. Alexandria was a key port for the Eastern Roman Empire. He didn't really care about, I need to protect the Coptic Christians. He was concerned about the Alexandrian port. It was a major city of trade and wealth and education. So Amr ibn al-As, once he's established, he felt comfortable and starts moving west over North Africa into modern-day Libya, Algeria, etc. The Byzantine emperor sees this as an opportunity to go back in and retake Alexandria. This is where the problem really happens. History says we wish he hadn't done that. When he went back in, the Amr ibn al-As realizes that they recaptured Alexandria. So he moves his armies back towards Alexandria. They finally push the Byzantine army out. This is all around the year 645. And in order to make sure they don't return, they burn down the entire city of Alexandria to the ground. So this is where now some of these things that we learn, who burned the library of Alexandria and all of that. So here's the thing. Alexandria has been burned several times. In fact, when you go to Alexandria, when I was there about 20 years ago, someone took me down into like the dungeons of an old church. It wasn't the major cathedral. And he showed me the layers. Over there you could just give someone khamsa gneh or whatever. And, he took me down. It was a little flooded, actually. And he showed me how many layers to the foundation. He said every one of those layers was an old city that they just keep building on top of the city every time it burned down. So the controversy or the question of, so who burned the Library of Alexandria? So I'm going to give you what I've gotten from several historic references. So the burning of that library, the reason it's so critical, it's not just, it was some library and it burned down, so what, move on with your life. No. That was like the equivalent of the Library of Congress today. Every written volume was housed in that library. Every manuscript, ancient or new, was in that library. Scientific research was taking place in that library. People like Euclid and old mathematicians, Greek mathematicians, studied in that library. People were doing research on the science of flight in that library. There were actually manuscripts found of vehicles that look like modern day, not modern day, but planes, flying airplanes. People found manuscripts of the Earth as a round globe. That research was taking place in the 7th century. Okay? The Earth wasn't known to be round till what year? 1492, when Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere, okay, North America. So the burning of that library, again, according to historians, set world history back hundreds of years. So it's not just about, oh, some books burned. Hundreds. I read in some places 800 years. The history of the world was pushed back or halted. So there are several stories. One story says the Byzantine emperor himself burned down the library before he left. Another story says, and then I'll tell you everyone's favorite story, because that's what you learn. Some people say it was fanatic Christian bishop that led a mob to burn the library so that the Muslims wouldn't get their hands on it. Possibly. The other story that seems to be the more popular one, again, that's why I never read one history book. You got to read the variety of different authors and not just Egyptian authors, because you'll get a very biased opinion, okay? Because when you read those, Muslims are bad, this is, you need to get the full picture. So you got to read some Western history books. So the story that seems to be the most factual, there's no hard evidence for any of this, is that Amr ibn al-As wrote a letter to Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was the Khalifa at that time, and told him, I found this library as they were burning the city down. So it's a fact that they did burn the city down. And he said, I found this building and there are all these writings in it. What should I do with it? And Umar ibn al-Khattab wrote back to him and told him, if the writings inside the library will help Islam grow, then don't burn it. If the writings inside don't have anything to do with Islam, burn it. And as a matter of fact, if there are already writings about Islam, we already have the Holy Quran, you don't need it, burn it. So basically, burn it. So the story is that Amr ibn al-As then sent his armies forward and they burned the library to the ground. Either way, who burned it doesn't matter, but it's a fact that it set world history back. Just to give you an example, any of you ever read any of the Greek poets like Sophocles? If any of you ever? Sophocles, how many poems do we have left? 7, 12? In the card, there was actually a catalog in the library, a log of everything that was written. And they found under Sophocles 400 poems. We only have 12 left. That's just one poet. We don't know what else we've lost. So we can't cry over spilled milk, as they say, and we got to move on. So what happens is, with the burning of the library, Egypt now becomes the hub, and Islam has spread all over Northern Europe, and the Europeans are still asleep. It wasn't until they moved into southern Spain. Spain was highly Christian at this point. They moved into southern Spain and north into Spain. If any of you go to visit northern Spain today, it's interesting. You will find old mosques that have been converted into churches. They built mosques all the way as far north as at the border of France in Spain. It wasn't until then that the bishop in Rome started to realize, oh, we have a problem. Because entering through Spain was the gateway now to Europe. It's not like the Europeans reacted like that either, by the way. The only reason the Arab or Islamic army stopped in Spain is because they needed to regain resource. They didn't have enough resources or men to move forward. It's the only reason they stopped. They, of course, were easily moving across Europe, across Asia. Here's another effect that Islam had that a lot of people don't realize. Any of you ever hear of the Silk Road in Asia? So that was kind of a gateway from Eastern Asia, like China, India, into Europe. It was a trade route. That trade route, yes, not only did they trade silk and gold and pasta or whatever, because the Chinese invented pasta, by the way, not the Italians. They were exchanging the stuff, but it was also a gateway for Europeans to bring Christianity to Asia. So they were actually moving east and starting to spread Christianity in places like China. The Muslim armies cut off that road. They invaded north into Asia, and they set a block, and so trade had stopped. When trade stopped, the spread of Christianity east stopped. This is why you'll see today in Asia, if you go to China or India, yes, there is Christianity, but Christianity was never solidly established in eastern part of Asia, beyond, Russia. It never really spread. It never really got established fully. It was always very on the periphery. And it was because of that road being cut off in the 7th century. So there was no more pathway. Okay? Just something for us to know. What ended up happening is that because Egypt was so important, the Amr ibn al-As at some point established governors that were in Egypt to look over Egypt. And this is now when the whole idea of the tax and conversions really start happening. Here's what happens. Around the year 743, a few things happen. Abdulaziz, who's a governor there in Egypt, starts off by telling Christians, you can now rebuild your churches that were destroyed, etc. Then realizes, wait a minute, we need funding, and our goal is to spread the faith, God, the one true faith. Okay? So what they start to do is a couple of things. Number one, they start to levy a tax on people. In fact, they made the patriarch of Alexandria personally responsible for collecting those taxes. So basically, if the taxes weren't collected, it's your head. So the tax first started as like a small tax. Things started to happen, like the official language was now no longer Coptic, but it became Arabic. I just want to throw that in there, is at first, Egyptians resisted Arabic. They said, how dare you, we change our language to Arabic. And it became official. Anyone caught not teaching in Arabic would be, jailed or killed. So Arabic becomes the official language, which eventually also had to become the official language in the churches. Just so you know, the Coptic language itself, until the 18th century, almost disappeared completely. Actually, people had to rediscover it because Arabic became very ingrained in the schools, in the churches, everywhere you went. This becomes a turning point for Christians because also the tax, it wasn't enough to just collect a simple tax. The tax became doubled and tripled to the point where a lot of poorer Christians found it easier to convert to Islam. It was easier to convert to Islam. In fact, between the years 743 and 900, it is said that 50% of Christians converted to Islam. So it happened very quickly, okay? Especially in Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt. At this point, the Pope is Abba Mikheil. He's actually known for a couple of reasons. He's known because the governor went to him and told him, if you don't collect the tax, we're going to kill every Christian. And they jailed him. They actually jailed him. And he asked if he would be allowed to go take a tour of Egypt to help convince people and to collect money. He was allowed to do so. He left prison, traveled all over Egypt. He used this as an opportunity to encourage his flock. He traveled all over Egypt, collected as much money as he could, and came back and gave whatever money he collected to the governor. Initially, it was accepted. Eventually, though, they turned against Abba Mikheil again, or Pope Mikheil, and they told him, nope, we need more money. This time, they imprisoned him again, and the Nubian king, who's Christian, southern in Central Africa, hears about this and says this is disgraceful. Now, those armies, the Nubian armies, were very powerful, and actually quite powerful and savage in their warfare. He sends a letter to the governor of Egypt, the Muslim governor, and tells him, if you don't release the Pope, we will invade Egypt. Here's something where another turning point happens. They moved their armies all the way north. They were on the border of Egypt. They entered what is modern-day Aswan, and they were ready to move in and liberate Christians from Islam. What happens? The Pope says, no, 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 you should really move back and let's be peaceful. So it's, okay, there are two ways to look at everything, okay? This is the Christian way, okay? It's not an eye for an eye. But at the same time, some historians, Western historians, wrote that this was a turning point. This was the first real possibility of Egypt remaining Christian. Because as time went on, Islam became so ingrained, it became more and more impossible to do that. Here, you still had 50% of the population, and you had this powerful army that could have liberated Egypt. So he moved all the way, and the Pope spoke on the behalf of and said, please move back. This is not what our Lord Jesus Christ taught. So he obeyed, moved back, and as a result, the governor allowed the Pope to go free and allowed them to rebuild churches and monasteries. You'll see throughout the history of Christianity, but specifically Coptic Christianity, they go through these cycles where destroy and burn. Okay, now you can rebuild. Rebuild, now destroy and burn. Until modern day times, there was still a law until recently, I don't know if it's still official, where you were not allowed to rebuild destroyed churches in the 21st century, like a few years ago. I don't know if that law has been changed, but these laws carried over. The inability of Christians in Egypt to not be allowed to rebuild made it very difficult. They had to do everything underground, whether it was monasteries. Again, I think I told the story. If you go to Upper Egypt, to Luxor and Aswan today, you'll see where some of the old temples, pharaonic temples, had been converted to churches. So you'll go into some of these pharaonic temples and you'll see that they built an altar and engraved, icons in the walls. I went on a tour a couple of years ago, and the guy was showing us these things. And there are things like most tour guides may not show you, because a lot of them are like hidden. And some of the tour guides actually were speaking against that, of how Christians destroyed and desecrated the pharaonic art. Okay? And by the way, some historians look at it that way. But you'll see a lot of crosses that have been engraved, and actually some of the ancient pharaonic paintings were scraped off to put icons of, Christian icons. So this was because they couldn't rebuild and they couldn't build. So they had to be innovative. Okay, I'm not going to get into the 9th and 10th centuries. But what happens is this sets the stage for a few things. One of the things is that Islam, as it becomes more established in Egypt, and again, Egypt becomes the cultural center of the Muslim world. Cairo is built as El-Qahira, or the Victorious, was built as a trophy to the new government, the new faith. So Cairo, modern day Cairo, was built as basically the Islamic center of the world. So this is why, again, you have things like the University of Al-Azhar. You have, the great mosques that were built. And then you'll read the stories of how a lot of palaces and things were built actually from the limestone that encased the pyramids. That actually is proven, because you'll see that in old, if you look at one of the pyramids, there's still limestone encasing on the top. That limestone took over 50 years to break off. And with it were built lots of palaces. Cairo was built, pretty much. So when you go to old Cairo, I forgot the big mosques that's there. What's it called?
Muhammad Ali?
Yeah, Muhammad Ali. Yeah, I think it's Muhammad Ali, right? So that was all built with the limestone of the pyramids. So when you go there to visit, you can make believe you're visiting a pyramid. I don't know. So that's where that was. But also, it sets the stage for Europe. So, later on, if we continue, we're going to talk about the Crusades. The Crusades didn't come out of nowhere as like this thing of, we're, horrible and evil. The Europeans became threatened, okay? It took a couple of hundred years. It wasn't until the 11th and 12th century that the Crusades started to take place. But the Crusades were grown out of this need to win back Christendom, okay? They wanted to regain Jerusalem. It's a topic by itself. But also, it sets the stage of Islam and the whole idea of, the Dar al-Islam, or the what?
Home of Islam.
Yeah, the home of Islam. Dar means house. I think I learned the word, Dar. So it all begins, this whole fanaticism that comes out. There's reasons for everything. So what I want us to be doing as we're listening and learning about this is that history really paints a canvas. And it's very difficult for us to just look at one point in time and say, this is bad or this is good. It's a journey. History is a journey. And that's why if we don't know history, we lose out on a lot. We don't understand why do we do certain things the way we do. A lot of people will say some of our traditions are Islamic. Some people will say that. Yes, it's not that they're Islamic, But the culture was ingrained in Egypt. Remember, how long was Christianity fully established in Egypt? How many years? 600? Less? Maybe 400 years? How long has Islam been established in Egypt? For like 1,500 years. Okay? So obviously it's going to have a huge influence. Okay? Europe will become, even though a lot of us will say here and say, oh, Europe and the Crusades and Roman Catholicism and what did they do? It was actually, in many ways, the Europeans and the Catholic Church at some point, again, I'm just giving you little flavors, that actually helped save or protect Christianity for a long time, for centuries. Okay? Now the tables are turning a little bit. But actually there was God places people in certain places for a reason. He places us even today here in Monroe, in the United States, whatever, for a reason. It's not that we're here. And as I read the history every time and I talk about it, I realize that none of this was like by accident. We're established here for a reason too, to spread the faith in our way. We're not here so we can get a better education. You could have gotten an education anywhere, okay? We're here for a reason, so we shouldn't be cocooned, okay? You'll see that as Islam gets established, Christians in Egypt get less and less protection. The rift with the Western churches becomes greater, and actually they lose sight of what's happening in Europe to a large extent. At some point, the Europeans actually go into Egypt and try to convert the Coptic Christians into Roman Catholicism. So you'll see a lot of that stuff going on. I'm going to stop here because as we get into the 8th century, the 9th century, there are actually a different kind of route taking place. So I'm just going to leave a few minutes for questions or thoughts.